You will hear a secret tonight that was never meant for ordinary ears. Imagine a house so quiet it eats the sound of your own breath. A house where lullabies were replaced by the clack of porcelain and the rustle of paper dresses. This is not a tale told to frighten children. It is instruction for the man who refuses to be fooled by the soft surface of civilization. Somewhere behind curtains stained with old sunlight, a family perfected a trade in absence. They learned how to pull a child's place from the world and fit something inert in its stead. You think you know what loss looks like, the funeral, the grave, the sob that follows, but you do not. The loss I speak of is surgical, bureaucratic, ceremonial, a replacement ritual conducted with the calm hands of those who believe institutions protect them even while they rot. They learned how to neutralize the unpredictable cruelty of living children, how to shield reputations and fortunes and what they feared most, exposure, by installing dolls in bedrooms, by editing registries, by training smiles to perform where flesh was missing. They fed neighbors stories, not truth. They taught teachers to look at faces and nod. They made priests bless what they had constructed, and it worked. For a time the town believed what it needed to believe, that this family was cursed, or saintly, or simply eccentric. But beneath polite condolences and village gossip lay a colder calculus. The substitution allowed power to persist over unpredictability. Replace a living mind with an object, and you replace potential rebellion with silence. Replace a messy human history with a tidy ledger, and you discipline chance itself. This is the practice of control disguised as grief. You are about to descend into the mechanics of that control. The techniques, the reasons, the error corrections, the cover stories so precise they become law. Pay attention like a man learning to see invisible threads. Because once you know how a family taught a town to forget its children, you will never trust the soft architecture of normalcy again. The thing to understand first is not cruelty but calculation. Cruelty can be spontaneous. Calculation is dangerous because it comes with paperwork and witnesses. This family did not awaken one night and decide to swap a child for an effigy. They methodized absence. They began by cultivating a narrative. The most impotent kind of magic. A story everyone agrees to tell. It sounds obvious, but narratives are the scaffolding of societies. Stories tell people where to look and where not to look. They trained midwives, bribed registrars, and cultivated friendships with a local doctor whose oath bent under gold and flattery. They learned how to manipulate record-keeping. Birth dates shifted, baptism rolls altered, photographs subtly retouched so a missing infant could be remembered as if still present. Often the first visible signs were small, mismatched shoe sizes, a woman who smiled a little too loudly when asked about her missing child, a closet full of clothes that never smelled of dust. The family used ritual to inoculate the town's curiosity, public offerings, tokens left at shrines, a pattern of deep religiosity that discouraged further questioning. People accept ritual. Ritual is a social anesthetic. The deeper mechanism was less theatrical and more administrative. Officials who could question the mother's account were quietly bought or discredited. Teachers asked fewer questions. Neighbors learned the rule: don't pry into the family's sorrow. By the time anyone realized something structural had been engineered, the replacement had metastasized into legal and social fact. The dolls were not merely toys, they were talismans, evidence that the family had integrated its replacement into public life. The objects were catalogued, photographed, referenced in wills and inventories. The household inventory reads like a ledger of absence: 1 porcelain child facing east, clothing 3 dresses, 1 rocking cradle disused. The ledger is the new authority, and authority is what men bow to when they cannot bear the cost of resistance. So understand this: what you are watching is not the pathology of a single household, but an anatomy of concealment. The family converted grief into governance. They built a microstate around a lie, and a lie that is administered like law becomes, for all practical purposes, truth. If you want the anatomy of this conspiracy, consider 3 pillars: performance, paperwork, and punishment. Performance is the visible theater, the funeral pageantry, the nightly vigils, the careful public composure that converts suspicion into sympathy. Performance is rehearsed pain. It teaches people when to look away without them noticing they've been trained. Paperwork is the invisible scaffolding, altered registers, sworn affidavits, sealed records, tools that make a narrative isolable from natural contradiction. Punishment is the final stabilizer, not always violence, often exclusion, gossip, social and economic pressure, sufficient to make a neighbor recant curiosity. The family wielded all three. When a curious aunt asked why there was no laughter in the nursery anymore, she received an invitation to dinner and a subtle reminder of how much the family had done for her. When a school teacher asked for a birth certificate, she was presented one with a gesturing signature and a pressed bloom tucked inside. When an investigator wrote too many questions in a ledger that could be subpoenaed, so many small slanders circulated overnight that his credibility bled out into rumor. This is the economy of soft power. Small acts that cascade into silence. In public, the story becomes scar tissue over the wound. In private, the family kept a different ledger, notes about who had been swayed, who had to be fed news, who might yet be dangerous. The dolls themselves were curated objects of devotion. They were bankable, fetishized, and hidden in trunks lined with cedar. Their eyes were often glass, reflective, revealing nothing. To introduce the dolls into social memory, they were photographed as if alive. A child's hand positioned on a painted cheek, a holiday card with an empty seat filled by an object, a family portrait where the doll sat upright and the world obliged with an approving lens. These images became evidence. Later generations would look at those photos and learn to believe. That is how institutions are made. An image becomes a record becomes law becomes habit, and a habit, repeated across years and births, hardens into an orthodoxy that hides predators in plain sight. There is a psychology that permits this. People who must be made complicit can be softened by ritual and fear, but also by meaning. The family sold meaning like a necessity. They were not monstrous for the sake of spectacle, they were strategic. They convinced their community that replacing a child could be a protective act, a sacrifice of the self to preserve lineage, property, reputations. We did it to save the others, they said. Who resists a justification cloaked in duty? The family appealed to patriarchal anxieties. Lineage must survive. Heirs must remain untainted by disease or madness. They invoked destiny, invoked bloodlines, invoked a history rewritten to favor their choices. With such language, they turned a crime into a tradition. And people, motivated by fear of being the next to fall under suspicion, complied. Social scientists will call this conformity. Philosophers will call it cowardice. You, if you listen as I want you to, will call it a mechanism, identity protection through narrative. Notice how they weaponized empathy. The family cultivated an aura of constant tragedy so well that empathy was exhausted before it could become curiosity. Neighbors who might pry were instead handed tasks. Iron these shirts, sew these buttons, attend this memorial. Actions that keep hands busy and mouths quiet. Meanwhile, in basements and attics, dolls received instruction in posture, their hair combed until it gleamed, their dresses mended so they looked well cared for. The optics mattered more than the truth. The family understood a fundamental rule of power: control the story, and the story controls the crowd. Over time, generations learned the rule as piety. Children raised inside that orbit grew up believing that the right thing sometimes involved hiding the living under blankets of civility. The result is not only a local crime, but a transmission of technique. A technique breeds replication. If you study these tactics as a manual rather than a horror, you begin to see how institutions, courts, churches, schools, can be trained to accept convenient fictions when the fiction protects the structure of authority. Look closely at the dolls. They are not inert props, they are instruments shaped to a function. Some were crafted with exquisite care: porcelain faces with eyelashes, hinged mouths meant to mimic mid-19th century babyhood. Others were crude, assembled from rag and thread, their seams visible like sutures. The selection was deliberate. Porcelain dolls served one purpose: permanence. They suggested a memorial, something that could be polished and passed down. Their fragility encouraged careful hands and limited contact. Rag dolls suggested humility and poverty, disarming auditors who might expect grandeur with guilt. The family used both types as rhetorical tools. When outsiders asked why a particular child could not play with neighborhood children, the family pointed to the fragility of the object and to propriety. She is delicate. When a midwife asked why there was no report of a cough or fever, she was given a sealed medical note claiming cause was sudden and easily explained, like a fever that resolved itself on the road to God. The doll's clothing was laden with meaning, a tiny shawl knitted by a grandmother who would publicly weep on command, a wobbly bonnet rumored to have been found at a wayside cross. These small stories made the dolls more plausible. The family also deployed what I call procedural theater, staged visits from relatives, a well-timed obituary in the local paper, a written plea published under the widow's name. Each element was a stitch. Remove one, and the garment still holds. The genius of the operation was redundance, multiple overlapping proofs that reinforced each other so that doubt would have to navigate a maze. And the maze was always guarded by community loyalty. Business owed to the family, favors to be repaid, marriages arranged, secrets kept. People do not betray those who can make their lives harder. The dolls became the fulcrum around which social leverage turned. This is how the mundane becomes monstrous, not through spectacle, but through the slow accretion of trust, transformed into a barricade against truth. You must understand the legal architecture that permitted this to persist. Paper records are the skeleton on which social reality is fleshed out. The family mastered archives the way generals master maps, birth ledgers, church registries, even tax records were adjusted with subtlety. A priest's marginal note here, a registrar's dated entry there, small interventions that create a plausible chain of custody for the lie. The family learned to corrupt trust rather than break it. They did favors for clerks, lent money to magistrates who later forgot to ask questions, paid for the binding of parish records that conveniently lost half a year's entries. When a stranger later demanded proof of a child's existence, the paper trail smiled back with the confident neutrality of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy by its nature denies the singularity of suffering. It catalogues, it indexes, it renders human life into entries that can be revised or archived away. The family weaponized that function. They created legal guardianships disguised as protections. They signed adoption papers under the guise of urgent health concerns. They drafted wills that described daughters that could not possibly be alive. The state, slow, polite, and accustomed to paperwork, became an unwitting accomplice. And when laws were consulted, the family pointed to precedent. They found statutes written in ambiguous language and interpreted them for advantage. Lawyers were either convinced by a well-paid argument or distracted by offers of retainer. The result? A bureaucratic inertia that prefers closed files to reopened wounds. Courts do not like messy human stories, especially when reopening one threatens reputations that are bound to property and influence. There is a lesson here for anyone who wants to wield power. Bend the archive, and you bend reality. Bend paper until it resembles truth, and men will swear by it. Consider the silence in the house itself. Silence was their accomplice. The family trained silence like a guard dog, teaching walls to swallow laughter, teaching halls to echo only the shuffle of polished shoes. Bedrooms became chambers of staged stillness, where dolls were placed in beds with sheets drawn to their chins. Visitors entered and spoke in hushed tones, afraid of waking what they imagined was a fragile, convalescent child. Silence does more than conceal. It shapes perception. When sound is absent, the mind fills in with assumptions, and assumptions are pliable. They understood that most people prefer not to pierce silence with questions. Silence, when combined with ritual, becomes sacred. And who challenges the sacred? Even the servants were recruited into the orchestration of quiet. They swept floors barefoot, muffled doors with fabric, carried trays with padded hands. Meals were consumed with heads bowed as if in prayer. The dolls sat at tables, motionless, their porcelain eyes catching candlelight in a way that made them seem almost watchful. Guests did not eat with children, they dined with symbols. The family knew a fundamental rule of psychological control. Noise invites inspection, silence sedates it. If you are learning from them, and you should, recognize how silence functions in every system of power you've ever entered. your workplace, your church, your government. They create silences around certain truths, and once silence sets in, it polices itself. People learn instinctively not to speak where speech feels dangerous. That is how control expands without force. It becomes self-enforced by those who fear the rupture of quiet. The dolls were not merely substitutes. They became conduits. Objects absorb meaning when enough belief is poured into them. Over time, the dolls grew heavier, not in weight, but in psychic charge. People whispered near them as if they might overhear. Women touched them for blessing. Men avoided their glassy stares. Slowly, the town began to treat the dolls as intermediaries between death and life. The family encouraged this, of course. They invented tiny rituals, placing sweets at the dolls' feet, tucking in letters, bowing heads when passing the nursery door. Each act deepened the illusion until the community itself became the keeper of the lie. This is how cults form, not always with fire and chants, but with small repetitions sanctified by secrecy. The dolls became sacred symbols, and sacred symbols are dangerous because they replace reality with a consensus hallucination. If everyone treats the doll as a child, then in the eyes of society it is a child. That is the power of collective belief. Reality is decided not by what is true, but by what is agreed upon. The family, whether consciously or not, stumbled into a principle the elite have used for centuries. Replace flesh with symbol and control belief. Replace truth with ritual and you control memory. Replace questions with consensus and you control history itself. Men who understand this principle cease being citizens and become rulers. The dolls then were not accidents. They were prototypes of power. It is tempting to think of the family as isolated villains. But pause and see clearly. They were simply early practitioners of a broader system. Their household was a laboratory for a much larger phenomenon, one you live inside today. Institutions learned to replace living children with symbolic dolls, only their dolls are not porcelain. Their dolls are paper money, flags, textbooks, certificates. When a man salutes a flag, he salutes cloth as if it were flesh and blood. When a banker looks at paper, he treats it as value, as if it were grain or gold. When a school teacher recites history, he reads from a script written not by the dead, but by committees who erased what did not serve. Do you see? You are still surrounded by replacements. The family simply dramatized the truth too vividly, and for that they became whispers in forbidden history. Institutions, by contrast, perfected subtlety. They taught you to accept replacements as natural. They trained you to call symbols reality. That is why you must not dismiss this story as grotesque eccentricity. It is blueprint. Once you recognize the principle, you will see it everywhere, in law, in politics, in religion. The family was not a horror story. It was a mirror. Imagine the first child truly gone. Flesh into soil, laughter into echo, absence into permanent void. That was the origin wound. But wounds terrify families of prestige. Prestige cannot tolerate cracks because cracks spread, and so the first replacement was not invention but defense. A porcelain body was chosen. A baptism was whispered over it. The family began to breathe easier. They found that one lie protected them from gossip, from shame, from the judgment of rivals. One lie became two became pattern. By the third or fourth substitution, they no longer remembered what was defense and what was design. This is how corruption always matures, from accident to strategy to system. It is the same in governments. One small falsified statistic, one minor secret execution, one suppressed scandal. At first, it feels like a shield. Later, it becomes habit. Finally, it is doctrine. What the family did in their home, institutions do across centuries. The dolls were not only masks for grief, they were incubators of power. That is the rhythm you must memorize. Grief becomes lie, lie becomes structure, structure becomes sacred. By the time anyone asks questions, the cost of truth is too heavy to bear. Now I must ask something of you. This knowledge cannot simply pass over your ears like another story. It must cut. It must root. It must awaken something in you that no institution can sedate again. If you have understood even a fraction of this descent, write these words in the comments. The doll is never silent. Do it once, then do it again. The act itself is not trivial. It is ritual, a symbolic fracture in the silence that governs you. When you comment, you declare yourself outside the consensus hallucination. You burn your name into the record of those who see beyond the dolls. Do not underestimate the act. Ritual is how power was stolen. Ritual is how it is reclaimed. Remember, the family thrived because no one broke silence. Break it here, twice. The doll is never silent. That phrase is more than engagement. It is initiation. Now, let us descend further. Consider the faces of the family themselves. Do not imagine monsters with fangs and glowing eyes. Imagine respectable faces, stern fathers with polished shoes, delicate mothers with lace at their wrists, siblings who bowed heads at prayer. Respectability was their camouflage. People do not suspect evil draped in etiquette. That is why the family could preserve their secret so long. They did not hide behind shadows. They hid behind manners. Every smile was rehearsed, every condolence precisely timed. The dolls were not merely replacements for children, the family themselves became dolls. Hollow vessels performing the gestures society expected, their humanity replaced by ritualized behavior. The transformation is chilling. The dolls in the nursery mirrored the dolls at the dinner table. People saw what they were supposed to see, a family persevering through endless grief, never questioning why the grief never ended. The real danger was not in the dolls at all. It was in the way the family sculpted themselves into symbols, teaching others to accept surface over substance. Once a man becomes a doll, a perfect performance of what society demands, his crimes vanish into applause. You might ask, how did no one rebel? How did no one shatter a porcelain skull against the floor and expose the fraud? The answer is simple. Rebellion is not suppressed by violence alone. It is suppressed by shame. The family weaponized shame like a surgeon wields a scalpel. If a neighbor whispered doubts, they were accused of cruelty, of hurting grieving parents, of lacking compassion, and no man wishes to be remembered as the one who insulted a mother's sorrow. Shame policed the town more effectively than any soldier could. This is the mechanism you must memorize. People fear being labeled cruel more than they fear being complicit in lies. You see it in history. Those who questioned official stories were called heretics, traitors, radicals. Shame isolates. Once isolated, a man learns silence. The family used this principle until doubt itself became unthinkable. The dolls did not have to convince anyone. The fear of cruelty did. And so the town learned the unspoken rule, better to pretend than to wound. That is how the lie metastasized into truth. But what of the children born later? The real ones who survived inside that house of replacements? Imagine their psychology. To grow up among dolls treated as siblings is to absorb the lesson that life and death are negotiable, that flesh is not sacred, that absence can be repainted into presence. Those children learned that love itself could be simulated, that parental affection was transferable to porcelain. What kind of adult does that create? An adult who understands that identity is performance, that truth is plastic, that people believe what is repeated. Some of those children carried the secret with fear, others carried it with pride. Some became ruthless, their empathy amputated. Others became fragile, broken by the constant knowledge that they could be replaced just as easily. Here is the darker truth. We are living in their legacy. Modern culture raises men the same way, teaching them that they too can be replaced. By careers, by machines, by illusions of status. The family was only the first laboratory. The experiment has scaled. Now let us descend into the theology they built. For a lie to survive generations, it must be sanctified. And so the family recruited religion itself. They staged private rituals where dolls were blessed, where prayers were recited as if over living children. Priests, bribed or blinded, presided with solemn tones. Over time, these rituals hardened into doctrine within the house. Dolls were souls in waiting, intermediaries between heaven and earth, bearers of sacrifice. With doctrine, suspicion was alchemized into reverence. People questioned less, worshipped more. Understand this. The family had discovered the most dangerous fusion of all, lies wrapped in holiness. That formula has shaped empires. Men will slit throats for politics, but they will crucify for faith. By sanctifying replacements, the family tapped a current of power that outlived their walls. Even now, institutions sanctify substitutions. War painted as peace, debt painted as prosperity. servitude painted as freedom. And just like the dolls, we kneel before them. But symbols decay. Porcelain cracks, fabric frays, and even the most obedient townsfolk notice when dolls do not age. By the third decade, questions returned. Why did these children never grow? Why were portraits retouched instead of reshot? Whispers spread again. The family responded with escalation. They began staging funerals for dolls, coffins carried into cemeteries, soil shoveled over silence, tombstones etched with names that belonged to no flesh. The town attended, wept, and left convinced. The trick was genius. They made the end of the doll look like the natural end of a life. That closed the loop. But it also deepened the grotesque. Imagine standing at a graveside, mourning a porcelain shell, and realizing, but never admitting, that your tears are for a lie. That is psychological slavery, and slavery of perception is the most enduring kind. Here is where the story cuts you personally, because you too have attended funerals for dolls, not porcelain, but ideas. You have mourned politicians who never served you, institutions that never protected you, histories that never happened. You were told to cry for them, to bow your head, to stand in silence, and you did. Because you feared shame, because you trusted symbols, because the ritual felt too sacred to question. Do not think yourself different from the villagers who mourned dolls. You are their descendant. The same manipulation that held their tongues holds yours. This story is not about them. It is about you. Until you see how many dolls you've saluted, worshipped, or buried, you are still inside their house. Still bowing to porcelain. Now I must remind you again, break silence. If you are still awake in this descent, prove it. Write again in the comments. The doll is never silent. Twice. Not once, twice. This is more than ritual. It is rebellion. Algorithms may read it as engagement, but we know it as initiation. You are etching yourself into a hidden ledger. Not their ledger, but one carved in defiance. When you speak the phrase, you join a brotherhood of those who see past porcelain. Do it, and you will never be the same. The family used silence to rule. We use words to shatter it. That is how men reclaim power. That is how you stop being another doll in someone else's collection. The final decades of the family's reign looked outwardly serene. Portraits hung in gilded frames. Estates grew larger. Wealth multiplied. Outsiders saw stability, refinement, nobility. But inside, rot spread. When a lie persists too long, it stops being a shield and becomes a parasite. Even the family began to believe their own story. Mothers whispered lullabies to porcelain. Fathers taught lessons to glass-eyed sons. Real children trapped in the house were measured against dolls and found wanting. Their laughter was seen as disrespectful, their tears as rebellion. Imagine the terror of being flesh among porcelain, knowing your worth was provisional, that silence was safety, and that too much humanity might end with you replaced. This is not just a story of deception. It is a study of how lies eventually devour their makers. The dolls became idols, and idols always demand sacrifice. When collapse came, it did not roar, it seeped. A fire consumed part of the estate, exposing trunks filled with porcelain heads and ragged limbs. Servants fled, villagers whispered, investigators arrived too late to recover records already burned. The family scattered, wealth fragmented, reputations blackened. But the dolls remained. Some buried in graves, some locked in attics, some sold at auctions where collectors marveled at their craftsmanship without knowing their origin. The physical artifacts survived longer than the people who worshipped them. That is the irony of symbols. They outlive flesh. And with each retelling, the dolls shed their grotesque truth and were rebranded as curiosities, antiques, treasures of the past. Even history itself joined the performance, reframing horror as heritage. That is why you are only now hearing this story in its unedited form. The lie mutated until it was no longer recognizable. That is what lies do when institutions need them. They calcify, they beautify, they disguise. So what is the lesson for you? That history itself is full of dolls. Every time you hear a simplified narrative, every time you read a polished textbook page, you are seeing porcelain where flesh once lived. Entire generations, Massacres, uprisings, erased and replaced with symbols. Nations do it, religions do it, corporations do it. They bury the flesh and they put porcelain in its place. What you were taught to call civilization is often nothing more than an elaborate dollhouse, arranged, staged, curated to keep you obedient. The family story is not an outlier. It is a metaphor made flesh. They were a warning, ignored, and now you live in a world where the replacement has scaled to global proportions. The dollhouse is no longer in a single home. It surrounds you, and unless you awaken, you will die in it. Bowing to porcelain, you mistake for truth. Here is the truth men fear most. Reality is fragile. It can be replaced. The family proved it with children. Institutions proved it with nations, and you must now decide what you will do with that knowledge. Will you remain a servant cradling porcelain and calling it holy, or will you smash the doll even if the town turns against you? Rebellion begins with one act of desecration, the refusal to worship what is false. That act costs. It may cost reputation, comfort, belonging. But understand this. Men who cling to porcelain die as props in someone else's theater. Men who break porcelain carve their own script. The family wanted silence. I'm asking you to choose noise, choose fracture, choose the weight of truth, even when it leaves you exiled. Because exile with truth is power. Belonging with lies is slavery. The deeper revelation is this: the family's story is not about death at all, it is about control. They discovered that whoever controls symbols controls memory, and whoever controls memory controls destiny. That is the forbidden knowledge hidden beneath every throne, every altar, every office of power. Kings, priests, presidents, they all know what the family knew, that flesh rots, but symbols endure. Replace the flesh, keep the symbol, and the masses will bow. This is why they censor, why they rewrite, why they drown dissent in shame. Because if you ever looked at the porcelain and said aloud, "This is not real," the entire edifice would crumble. Power does not fear enemies. It fears exposure. It fears the man who sees past porcelain. That man cannot be ruled. And so I tell you plainly, you have a choice tonight. You can leave this story as a curiosity, a grotesque piece of forbidden history, and you will forget it in days, returning to your rituals of porcelain. Or you can let it cut into you, reshape you, wake you. That is what this descent was always meant to do, not to entertain you, but to initiate you. If you have listened this far, you already feel it. The unease in your chest, the suspicion that you've lived your entire life inside a dollhouse. That is the beginning. Do not run from it. Lean into it. Break the silence. Break the ritual. Break the porcelain. Become the man who sees. This is where we end. Not with comfort, not with closure, but with a demand. The family that replaced their children with dolls is not a relic. It is a mirror. Look into it. See yourself. See the institutions that bind you. See the rituals that silence you. And then decide, will you remain in the dollhouse polishing porcelain, mourning symbols, obeying silence, or will you smash it? The transformation begins the moment you declare, aloud or in writing, "The doll is never silent." That phrase is your weapon. That phrase is your fracture line. Say it, twice. Carry it like fire. Tonight you have heard knowledge men were never meant to hear. It cannot be unheard. You are no longer asleep. You are no longer a doll. From this moment forward, you are the crack in the porcelain. The descent is complete. The awakening is yours.